Hey guys, and welcome to Let's Talk Charlotte Mason. I'm Sarah, and in this video I'm going to get very real and personal. Our homeschooling path was not neat or linear or picture perfect at all when we began, and to be honest, it's still not. Like many families, we began with hopes and ideas and expectations of what learning at home might look like for us, but I very quickly realized that many of the traditional approaches and even many homeschool approaches were not fitting for the child who was in front of me. What looked like resistance was often anxiety, and what looked like refusal was often overwhelm. And what was categorized as defiance by everyone else was often a nervous system that was in distress. I was drawn to the beautiful ideas of Charlotte Mason, that children are born persons, that education is an atmosphere, a discipline, and a life, and that learning can be rich and gentle and deeply human. So this video is about where those two worlds meet, which is, as it would have it, in my homeschool room. I'll be sharing honestly about our homeschool journey, the lessons that I've had to unlearn, the ways that we've adapted Charlotte's principles for our child with PDA, and the peace that we've found by changing our focus and our lens. If you're a homeschooling parent with a child who doesn't quite fit the usual mold or needs a lot of things tweaked for them, if you're weary of the power struggles, if you long for a more peaceful way, I hope you feel at home here. Let's get started. Now, before I share about our first year of homeschooling, I think it helps to understand the season that we were coming out of as we made that shift. For much of my daughter's early years, we lived with one primary boundary for her above all else, and that was you must be safe. Everything else was a negotiation. Many everyday things that other families may have simply required had to become conversations and negotiations and adjustments or carefully worded and navigated moments. We were learning, often without the language for it yet, that her nervous system could move very quickly from seemingly okay into fight or flight. And what may have appeared to others as strong oppositional kind of behavior or nature and defiant behavior was often her experiencing genuine anxiety and overwhelm. Before homeschooling, we did try her in a special school setting. We hoped that it might support her and be the right fit for her like it was for our older son. However, the experience meant that when we eventually did bring her home to homeschool, there was a longer transition period than I had expected. We were not beginning from neutral ground as if we had begun homeschooling her straight out of those early years. We were beginning after stress, after mismanagement, and with a child who needed time and space in order to feel safe again. At the same time, homeschooling itself was not a sudden or desperate decision. I had been researching homeschooling for many years beforehand, and I had also been drawn to Charlotte Mason and her approach for a very long time. Deep down, I always sensed that my children, who both have been diagnosed with disabilities, were unlikely to thrive in a traditional mainstream school environment. So I was already searching for other ways of learning that might fit them long before we actually began. By the time our first homeschool year started, I carried both all of this preparation, these years of study about the method that I wanted to use and what homeschooling could be like, and also, I carried this uncertainty because I had no practical experience to back up all of my research. I had ideas and I had books, examples from other homeschool mums, even veteran homeschool mums, and I had expectations and hopes. But I also had a child whose needs required me to hold every plan so loosely it felt like it would blow away in an instant. So our first year was not simply about beginning lessons, it was about rebuilding her trust, creating safety for her, and learning a new rhythm and discovering what education could look like for the child who was in front of me. Now, I'm probably understating it when I say that our first homeschool year did not look like the picture that I had imagined. And if I'm honest, it didn't really look like any recognizable Charlotte Mason homeschool at all. And that scared me a lot. It looked far more eclectic, improvised, reactive, and responsive than I had ever expected. I knew where I hoped we were heading, towards the richness and the beauty of Charlotte Mason's principles. But I also knew that it would take us so much longer to get there than it seemed to for other families. And that was something I had to learn to make peace with. There were moments and seasons I felt so discouraged when I compared what our days looked like to other homeschool rhythms. If I sought advice, the answers often leaned towards use firmer authority, greater consistency, and more conventional expectations and approaches that simply did not work for my daughter who sat in front of me. And even now, that feeling can occasionally resurface, especially if I'm starting to do the comparison again. So in that first year, I learned about embracing where we truly were. We used many picture books and shorter living books that could be finished in one sitting or one lesson. Think more of the preschool kind of books in length. Longer readings and heavy expectations would easily create fatigue and resistance and meltdowns and overwhelm. So shorter, complete experiences often worked beautifully versus drawn out, try and meet this other expectation for her. Something else I did was I often presented the time as an experience to enjoy and do together rather than a lesson to be endured. I also continued to incorporate some worksheets during our transition time. Though I personally wanted to move away from them, they were familiar to my daughter. And a sudden shift into a completely different learning style felt so strange and unsettling for her, and sometimes caused shutdown and complete disengagement with learning entirely. So this familiarity of learning material gave us a bridge that we could slowly move towards where we wanted to go. Open communication was so important. I found it helped to explain why we were doing things, what the purpose was, and that she had choice in it as well, and that it was an absolute must-have for her to be able to do anything with what we were doing. So to engage with anything we were doing, she needed to understand why. Many PDA children seem to think of themselves less as little children and more as adults in child bodies, and more as a whole person who expect to be spoken to with honesty and dignity. And this pairs beautifully with Charlotte's principles. So telling them that they have to do something just because you expect them to do it is pretty much guaranteed to fail with children with PDA. We could not follow a fixed curriculum with daily expectations for the life of me. The workload was often too much, and the idea that we were definitely doing a certain lesson on a certain day, regardless of her capacity that day, created immediate stress, not only for her, but for me. And that's not something that I wanted to experience every single day in our homeschool. So I had to hold plans extremely loosely and focus more on, is this heading in the direction we want, versus then we must do this schedule. During that year, she was especially drawn to fantasy and imagination and stories. So I tried to connect as much of our learning as possible to those interests. So stories became a pathway into relationship and engagement. We made constant adjustments. Oh, the adjustments. If formal math lessons were refused one week, I suggested we play a board game instead. smart redirecting, smart thinking, on our toes thinking all the time. So instead of official math lessons, we baked, we measured the ingredients, we made paper airplanes, and then said, okay, well, who's went the furthest? Who's went the shortest? We measured things for household projects. We counted and estimated and compared and problem solved in real life. Real life maths. So we didn't lose anything in our maths learning for that week. We just changed. The same was true for language arts. We read shopping lists, we wrote labels, we noticed signs, we played with words naturally in the flow of life. And we also began to embrace a special experience called Poetry Tea Time, which is still a fave. Much of our learning happened in ordinary moments, and responsibility was often dressed in the clothing of fun and autonomy. Being in charge of getting the milk at the grocery store, helping choose produce, organizing a bag for an outing, deciding which spoon was needed for baking. And sensory play became a large part of our learning as well. I might casually wonder aloud, what do you think will happen if I poured water over the sandcastle? Or I wonder which container will hold more. I tried to invite her thoughts often, even if I never received an answer. The invitation itself mattered, not her response to it. When she was elevated or clearly dysregulated, I learned to reduce demands and let go of my agenda for the day. Sometimes I had to accept that the lesson plan that I had in mind was just not going to happen today. And that's really hard. It can feel like failure, and it can feel so disappointing and discouraging, and it can feel like you're getting nowhere, and that all the progress that you have made is slipping away because you're not taking that next step when you thought you would. But many times the wiser path was to shift all of my attention toward connection and engagement in what she could do that day, rather than focusing on what she could not do or what we weren't getting done. Tomorrow was another day that we could try again. I had to keep reminding myself to respect her as a person. And as for us, that included respecting the nervous system that she had been given, working with it and around it, and gently stretching its ability when we could. I also learned to double down on the Charlotte Mason elements that she genuinely enjoyed and wanted to participate in all the time, particularly the enrichment subjects. So folk songs and picture study and solfa. These were subjects she loved doing, so I made sure to include them as much as possible. We went on many excursions together to wildlife centres and museums and information centres, parks, and into the city. To her, these felt like enjoyable outings, but to me they were rich education filled with observations and ideas and vocabulary and wonder and living knowledge. One of the biggest mind shifts for me involved narration. And because any firm request or demand for a narration failed miserably every single time, guaranteed. This was so difficult because you know that that's one of the main anchors of a Charlotte Mason approach. And I love the idea of narration and I can see its value. But I had to loosen my expectations again and recognize that retelling knowledge cannot be forced into life. Oftentimes we would model narration for her afterwards, like during dinner when we were talking about our day and something that we remembered from our lessons or our day. Sometimes it appeared in play. Sometimes it came through drawings, comments, or connections that she made days or weeks afterwards. And sometimes it didn't come in ways that I could easily measure. So throughout that year, I had to remind myself often that God has given me this child to parent and the responsibility that comes with that. There is a purpose in the path we've been given, even when it looks different from the one that I expected to walk. Our first year was not polished, efficient, or impressive, but it was real. And slowly, beneath all the adapting and the adjusting and the grieving and the relearning, something good was being built within our homeschool. So when I look back on that first year of homeschooling, I don't see a year that was behind everyone else or not what it should be. I see a year that was foundational for us. It was the year we began learning how this child learns. The year I started releasing comparison. The year I learned that peace can matter way more than productivity. The year I began understanding that education is not only what happens at a table with books and with pencils and paper, but it's what's formed through relationship and atmosphere, wonder, curiosity, and trust. Did we do everything I hoped we would do? Nope. Did it look like the homeschool vision I once imagined? Absolutely not. And you know what? It still doesn't. But it gave us something deeper than a polished schedule or a checklist could ever do. It gave us connection. It gave us safety. It gave us a beginning that honored our reality, the reality that we were living. And from that place, so much more could grow. So if your homeschool feels messy, slow, unconventional, or nothing like you expected, I just want to gently encourage you that a slow beginning is still a beginning. And adaptation is not failure. Building trust is never a waste of time. Sometimes the unseen work becomes the most important work of all. Thanks so much for being here and sharing an hour's homeschool story. I'd love to know in the comments, if you're a homeschool mum of a neurodivergent child, what has your first year taught you? Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you in the next video.